All right. Hey, everyone. It is time for a really quick 3M philosophy thing where I kind of go over certain things that people wanted to learn about philosophy. And the other day, I was doing some things with the square of opposition that I've used to check the validity of a lot of my work that I do on my blog and the paper that I wrote. And it seemed like a lot of people weren't too familiar with the square of opposition. So I thought I'd kind of like take a few minutes to kind of explain the canonical square of opposition, exactly kind of what it is, why it's used to check for validity. I do know there are some issues with the square of opposition. There are some issues if you have empty sets, because every set has a null set, and because of that, you have what's called existential import and things of that nature. But as long as it's one member of the set, these things work fine. And so I'm assuming that there's at least one member of a set when I do these things. But like I said, I kind of wanted to go over with you real quick, just basically how to understand the square of opposition. So when I do use it, and I use it in a blog or I use it in something that I write, you kind of understand what the hell I'm talking about, right? That'd be kind of nice. Make sure that you can hear me properly. I have my audio settings working fairly well, it looks like, actually. So anyways, hey, you to Hef, how you doing out there? Howdy, howdy. All right, let's kind of dive into it, because again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It is dry, it is boring, I think, but it might be useful to one or two people, and that's what matters. If somebody gains some information and knowledge off of it, then hey, you know what? I'm happy. So let's kind of dive into it. This is the canonical, meaning the standard traditional Aristotelian form of the square of opposition. And basically, it's a way to relate sets. Especially when you have like nested sets. It's a way to say, okay, how are these things related, and how can they be related? In other words, if certain things are true, then certain things have to be false. If certain things have to be false, certain things have to be true. And so when you look at the relationships, you have on the right and left-hand side what's called subalterations or subalt terms. And basically, these are implicatures. These things are saying, okay, if the top is true, it implies the bottom. Okay, it's not like it's a logical necessity as far as like if this then must this, but it's just an implication. Okay, the contradictions, which are diagonals, like the AO is a diagonal, the E to I, and those are standard. A, E, I, O. Basically, if you see them when you're looking at these Aristotelian sets, they stand for all or every, or no, not one, some S is P or some S is not P. So when you see these letters A, E, I, or U, that's what they're representing. A is all S or P, or every S is P. E is no S is P. I is some S is P, and O is some S is not P. So the contradictories were these be diagonals. In other words, if A is true, then O must be false. If O is true, then A must be false. These are called contradictories, meaning they are absolutely mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. Either you're a duck or you're a non-duck, right? E is the same way. Either there's nothing in that set, there's no S or P, or no S is P, or some S is P. It's one or the other, right? There's at least one in that set, or there's none. So if I said, like, for example, if every S is P, if I said all dogs are mammals, and then S is the number, the dogs, P is the set of mammals, right? So every dog is a mammal. That is a fact, right? There are no dogs that exist that are not mammals. So if that's the case, then looking at the square of opposition, we can figure out what are the other truth values for A, E, I, or O, or if it's indeterminate. The top part, the contraries, the AE, those mean that both of them can't be true, false at the same time. Both of them can't be true at the same time. Both can be false at the same time. One can be true, or the other can be true. Okay, and the bottom is just the opposite. Both of them can be true at the same time. Both of them can't be false at the same time. One is true, the other's false, or the other's false, the other's true. So there's a relationship there, and these are just standard forms. So if A is true, then you can go through. Okay, what is the implication if all dogs are mammals? Okay, well, if all dogs are mammals, then there's no S that is P, right? There's nothing in that set. E is false, right? Because there could be no dog that's not a mammal, right? No dogs are mammals. Well, that would be impossible, right? If we said that all dogs are mammals, then if A is true, then E must be false, because there are no dogs that are not mammals, right? And so if A is true, we can go through and go, okay, well, what are the implications of that? If all dogs are mammals, let's work through this. I'm kind of doing this on the fly, but all dogs are mammals. Okay, well, that implies that for E, no dogs are mammals would be false, right? Because all dogs are mammals. So there are no dogs that, so if I say no dogs are mammals, that's a false statement, right? Clearly, because we've already established all dogs are mammals. So what about I? Okay, well, if all dogs are mammals, then it is true that some dogs are mammals, right? Yeah, some dogs are mammals. Yeah, okay. Well, if all dogs are mammals, then some set of that, some subset would be, yes, all dogs are mammals. Therefore, some dogs are mammals. So I would be true. Well, what about O? Some dogs are not mammals. Well, that has to be false, right? Because there are no dogs that are mammals. E is empty. If E is empty, then O has to be false. So this is how you can do these relationships to say, okay, if this is the case, how do these follow? So if A is true, then E is false, I is true, and O is false. And then you can just kind of go through there from there. Okay, so what about E? Let's just say E. If no dogs are mammals. Okay, if no dogs are mammals, right, which is false, but I mean, if say no fish are mammals or something, right? You change it, right, because no fish are mammals is true, right? No fish are mammals because fish aren't mammals. If no fish are mammals and E is true, then let's go through this and see what the other corners would be. Well, if E is true, then A here has to be false, right? Because if no fish are mammals, then it cannot be true that all fish are mammals. Because no fish are mammals. So A is false. The contradictory I has to be false, because again, these are always going to be opposite each other. If this is true, then this opposite is always going to be false. Contradictories are always going to be mutually exclusive. So if E is true, no fish are mammals, then, somebody's calling me and I can't talk right now. Hang on. Let me get back to you, good sir. One sec. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. See, Ansfrida says, you mean you don't use the dodecahedron equivocation? I do use the hex. There's obviously the hexagonal, but I tried to include something to make it even like a pentagonal type shape using innocence, and it's been really confusing. I was like, okay, this is going to take a little bit more than my brain power can do at the. Mammals are a polyphyletic group. No, wait. Mammals are polyphyletic, obviously, because tetrapods have been removed, right? So, yeah, we are tetrapods. That is polyphyletic. So anything that comes to that, like monophyletically, we are fish, obviously, but fish is a group, right? So assume monophyletic right here, U to F. But monophyletically, no fish is a mammal, right? I mean, paraphyletically, yes, fish are mammals because we're fish. Not all fish are mammals, right? But some fish are mammals because we're fish, we're mammals, but that's monophyletically, and that's confusing because that's biology. But anyways, let's assume, though, we're talking monophyletically. So no fish is P. So E is true. If E is true, then what follows? Okay, well, if E is true, then A is false. I has to be false because it's contradictory. And O has to be true because if no fish are mammals, then it can't be true that some fish are not mammals, right? That's true. Yeah, some fish are not mammals because none are mammals. So if E is true, then A is false, I is false, and O is true. And generally speaking, what you'll find is, it's like pretty much all the time. I can't imagine how it wouldn't be, but A and I is always the affirmative. E and O is usually the negative, right? So this is always on the affirmational side. These top part right there, those are called universal quantifiers, and these are called particular quantifiers, meaning that they're only sometimes true, right? But universal is all, right? So the universal quantifications up at the top, those are going to be either all or none, which is universal for a category. So let's look at some interesting stuff here, because what happens, interestingly enough, is when you start getting down to these subcontraries. We've already established that subcontraries can be both true. They both can't be false, but both can be true. And if one true, the others can be false, and vice versa, right? So this is kind of interesting. So let's see what happens if I is true. Okay, let's just say that some dogs are mammals. Okay, well, that's a true statement, right? Some dogs are. Well, you know, it's funny, Asfrida, you say some rocks are, but rocks are invertebrates because of lack of backbone. But you know what's funny is they just decided in California to put bees, certain 4 species of bees under fish, Because they're invertebrates. Because the Wildlife Conservation Act in California, whatever the specific name would be, had said fish, and that includes all mollusks, marine life, and invertebrates. It doesn't differentiate anything beyond that. So the court had determined that invertebrates include bees, but it also includes everything else that's an invertebrate. So I don't know the reasoning on that, but if you go look it up in the news, the California court system just established that 4 species of bees are considered to be fish as far as wildlife protection. Yeah, it's odd. I mean, I understand their reasoning because they are invertebrates and the way it's worded, but somebody probably should have stepped in and go, okay, maybe we need to reword this so it makes more sense. Because fish is a colloquial term. Yes, monophyletically we are fish, but most people don't go around saying we're fish because fish connotes a very specific meaning to people. I mean, when we say fish, you say you're going fishing, people know at that point you're going to a lake or an ocean or a body of water, and you're going to try to get fish. You're not hunting people, right? If you say I'm going fishing and you say, well, that includes people, that might be a problem, right? So words have usages. So yes, even though strictly speaking, monophyletically we are fish, it doesn't make sense to really use fish in that usage because it conveys ambiguity there, because it clearly we don't mean when we're going fishing we're going to be hunting humans, right? All right. So anyways, back to this. So some SRP. So if I is true, right? Some dogs are mammals, then clearly the opposite has to be false, right? Because these are contradictories. The opposite is always false. So if some dogs are mammals, then it cannot be possible that no dogs are mammals. Because if no dogs are mammals, then some dogs can't be mammals, right? If E is true, then I has to be false. So the converse, or the opposite has to be true. So I is true, E has to be false. And then the problem that you run into is A and O are indeterminate. Just by saying I is true, you can't determine whether it's A or O is true. You can't determine a truth value here. The only thing you determine truth value-wise is on the contradictory is E. Because if I say some dogs are mammals, right, that doesn't tell me anything about whether some dogs are not mammals. I haven't established the veridicality of A, right? I don't know. I don't. If I didn't know what dogs and mammals were, it wouldn't tell me, right? If I just say some S is P, okay, does that mean some S are not P, or does that mean every S is P? I have no idea. It doesn't tell me. It's indeterminate. Does that make sense? Because if I didn't know that some dogs are mammals, if I didn't know that this and A was true, because A implies the fact that I is true. This is a subalternation. Remember, if A is true, then it implies B is true. If E is true, it implies O is true. So I don't know if I is true because A is implying it through the subalternation, or if I is true because there are some that are P and some that are not P. In this particular case, we happen to know it's A because we know all dogs are mammals. But what happens if you didn't, right? What happens if there was just some category? You know, you just say some gumballs are blue. Okay, yeah, but not all gumballs are blue. Some gumballs are not blue, in which case it would be the bottom two, right? So these two would be true. But just saying that some are doesn't tell you if all are or if some are not. So when you say I is true here, that means that A and O is indeterminate. Same thing that happens over here in O. If you're on O, then we can say the opposite is false because this is a contradictory, right? So if I say, okay, some S is not P, okay, then clearly every P is false, because if every S is P, you want to have some that are not P, right? So if this is true, then this has to be false. Again, the diagonals are always going to be opposite. If this value is true, this has to be false. But now you have I and E is indeterminate, because you don't know if some S are not P merely because there are no S that is P, or because there are some that are P and some that are not P. Again, some gumballs are not blue. Okay, does that mean some gumballs are blue? Or does that mean that there are no blue gumballs? Let's say in a jar, right? In the jar, some of the gumballs are not blue. That doesn't tell you anything. It's non-specific. I say, here's a jar of gumballs, and I say, hey, some of them aren't blue. Does that tell you that all of them are blue? That there are no blue? No, it doesn't tell you anything. It says, let's go back to this one. The I might be easier. Some gumballs are blue. Okay, I have a jar, and I've just told you some gumballs are blue. And it's Frida. Does that tell you if every gumball is blue, or if some are blue and some are not blue? Santa Frida, he'll know the answer. Well, I mean, I can tell you, I can tell you right now, obviously. Yeah, I'm just gonna tell you. Yeah, clearly it doesn't tell you, right? I mean, if I just say, hey, some of them are blue, it doesn't mean all of them are blue. Some of them do not. That doesn't imply all. You can't work the converse of this subaltern or subalternation. You can't work it backwards. That's why the arrow, see the arrow at the bottom here? That's why none of these have arrows except for these two on these sides. Right and left have arrows. Why do they have arrows? Because it only goes one way. It only holds true if A is true, then I is true. It doesn't hold true if I is true, then A must be true. It doesn't work on the converse. Right? All you know if I is true is that E is false. These can be either true or false. You don't know. He missed a question. All right, I'll try again. If I say some gumballs are blue in the jar, you have a jar. I have a jar. You can't count how many there are. And I just say, hey, it's Frida, some of those gumballs are blue. Does that give you any information to decide whether all of them are blue or some are blue and some are not blue? Right? It doesn't tell you. This is ambiguous and indeterminate. Right? Now, and you can work this through any reasonable way you want. You can. I mean, I don't even know what reasonable would be. But let's say I pick one. Let's say, okay, I want to say O is false. Some S is not P. Okay, what does that imply? Let's work through it. The contrary, A has to be always the opposite, right? So if O is false, A has to be true. And if this is false, then E has to be. Let's see. If O is false, then A has to. If A is false, then A has to be true. E has to be false, and I has to be true. Because if this is false, that means that that E cannot be true. This has to be false. Some S is not P, then it cannot be the case that no S is P. So if this is false, the opposite is always the negation. So if this is false, this has to be true. E has to be false, and I has to be true. So if you say, okay, this is true, if this is false, right? Not if it's true. If it's true, it's indeterminate. But if this is false, then I can make a determination. Same thing with the I. If I is false, right? If I is false, I know the opposite is by the fact is a contradictory, right? Contradiction. This has to be true. So if this is false, this has to be true. If this is true, this by implication, by the subalternation implies O is true. Right? And if this is false, then A has to be false because this implies this. So if this is true, then we say let's see here. No, I'm sorry. If this is false. If this is false, then this has to be false. Because if you say there are no dogs that are mammals, right? If this is false, some dogs are mammals is not true, which means there's no dogs that are mammals, or at least not there's no some dogs are not mammals. Then you cannot say every dog is not a mammal. So this has to be false if this I is true. So I is true, A is false, E is true, and O is true. Does that make sense? Did I go through too fast in there? And like I said, you can just work through it. If I happens to be false, always just do the contradictories first. If I is false, then contradiction has to be the opposite. So this has to be true because this is false. This has to be true. If this is true, this has to imply that O is true because by implication, if O is true, then A has to be false because this is a contradictory. You can just work it that way. True, false. False, true, true, false. And so both of these on this side is false. Both of these sides are true. That's why this is usually, both of these are usually the same, and both usually the same because again, this applies this. If E is true, then implies O. If A is true, then implies I. So this is one of the reasons why I use it for testing out things dealing with atheism and theism, right? Because if all theists believe God exists, right? Then that implies some atheists believe God exists. That's true, right? Would you agree, Anna Frida? If all atheists believe all theists believe God exists, then it is the case by the subalteration that I must be true. That some theists believe God exists. With me? Now, if this is true, right, then the E must be false, which would say that no, if every theist believes God exists, and there are no theists that do not believe God exists, right? That'd be the opposite, right? So for every member of A, so if somebody's a member of A, they cannot be a member of E. All theists believe God exists. So if you're a theist, you cannot believe God does not exist, right? So E would be the opposite of that, or the contrary of what it is. So if A is true, we've already established that E is false, I is true, and O is false. So let's look at this. A is true, I is true. Yes, some theists are believe God exists. E is false. There are no theists that don't believe God exists. And O would be, if this is true, that has to be false. So some theists believe God does not exist. Has to be false, right? So both of these are false. E and O are false, which makes sense, right? And A and I are true. So that makes sense. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I check for validity. Okay, is it making sense? Because if you believe God exists, then you cannot believe God does not exist, and there are no members of that set O that are believers that God does not exist, right? Some theists believing God does not exist would not exist in O. So E and O have to be false. A and I have to be true if A is true. So this is the reason why when I say like atheist believe God does not exist, it only really makes sense if E is that position. If E is the position that no S is P, that means no theist believes God does not exist. That would only make sense if that's the same as an atheist position, as the atheist believes there are no gods. And if you work through this, you'll see that works out spectacularly well. Because what you end up with here is on E, let's say you say no atheist believes God exists, right? Which is true. And that's true, then this has to be false because there are no some that believe God exists. Now, working with what's called a symbiotic square of opposition, you can make it instead of having categories like this, you can just make it relational. So if this was just the relationship up here of E, that atheism as the belief God does not exist, that implies a non-belief. So atheism as the belief God does not exist would imply you don't believe in God, which would be O. And if you don't believe in God, then the negation of that would be you do believe in God, which would be a theist up here. And if you do believe in God, that implies you do not believe that God does not exist, which would be the negation of E. That's how I went about proving my paper that if you are in fact a weak atheist, you are also a weak theist and an agnostic. This is the way you can validate that my proof is correct, right? It is valid because if you hold to these two subcontraries, right? If you're basically saying, okay, some atheists believe, some atheists don't believe. Okay, well, some theists believe, and that has to follow that some theists don't believe that God exists. If you're using this particular structure, then it has to follow. It just has to follow. So you end up with some position down here called weak theism that says, okay, you don't hold there are no gods, but you don't hold that there is a God either. You're down here. And here is the same thing. You're holding that, okay, you're not holding the position there are no gods, and you're not holding the position that no gods exist. You're down here. So this is why I always say if you don't have a positive epistemic status, which would be A and E up here, the only thing left is a subcontrary to be in. Because remember, O is indeterminate if that's positive, right? If it's true, then E and I are indeterminate. If O is true, if you're down here, which would be a weak atheist. Remember, if atheism is up here, believes God does not exist, which implies you don't believe God does exist. If you're down here and you don't believe God does exist, you cannot be a theist. And so this, is false. If you're down here as weak atheist, if you remember my you want me to show you my diagram, just in case for people in the future that have not seen it. Oops, this. That way they know what I'm talking about. Because I keep forgetting that there might be other people that watch this that have not seen this before. So put this up there. It's this one. Nope, that's not it. Let me find this real quick, because like I said, people might watch it, might want to see this afterwards. There we go. That's this one. All right, so let me put this one on the screen real quick for you guys. So this is how I used my square of opposition to prove the validity of my argument. Is that if you have atheism or theism up here, believes God exists, then the negation would be does not believe God exists, and that's true. These aren't negations; they're contradictories, right? Diagonal. And if you assign that the label atheist, right, then what do you call the position of the person who believes there are no gods? Well, it has to be atheism as well, right? I mean, a person who believes there are no gods implies you do not believe that God exists. So this position has to be atheism as well. You can call strong atheism and weak atheism, okay, right? And it would be strong theism and weak theism. But both of these on this side has to be the position of atheism, because if not, you leave atheism out of the rain, as Draper would say. So this is how I prove that if you are this position down here, if you're down here and say, I merely lack a belief God exists, right? Well, what happens? What happens there? Well, if you're down here and you're an O and you don't subscribe to E, right? Then it is indeterminate. Remember, if O is true, then A is false, which is true, but E and I are indeterminate. You don't know which one it is. If you're O and you don't have a positive belief God exists, the only other option for you is I, which means that you have O and I, right? And if that's the case, and the only other option for you is I, then if you're down here and you don't subscribe to this up here, the only other option is down here is would be weak theism. And if you have weak theism and you have weak atheism, that's agnostic. And if you go look in the literature, it exactly says not BSG and not BS, not G and not BSG. This is the agnostic position. You don't believe either way. You don't believe God exists. You don't believe God does not exist. And so by calling this atheist, you can call this weak position theist, and you end up semantically with a person who's agnostic theist and an atheist, all because they are indeterminate. This is what I keep trying to tell atheists. By using the lack of belief definition of atheism, you're not conveying anything about your position. You're indeterminate. And this is logically provable using the square of opposition to check for validity. Because again, if you're down here in the right corner, all you can say with certainty is that you're not a theist because of the contradiction. That's it. Other than that, I don't know whether you believe there's a God, or I don't know if you have no position either way, which would be agnostic. It is indeterminate. This is why down here, these are not great labels to have. And again, normally you could say, okay, I'm a weak atheist. Okay, if you're a weak atheist, then you're also a weak theist. It's inescapable. The logic is inescapable. Yes, it is semantics, sure. But what else do you want to call that position? If you call this weak atheist, and how is this not weak theist? And even if you don't like that term, even if you don't like the term weak theist, you're still agnostic because you have no position either way. And so this is what happens when I see atheists try to assume this agnostic position, right? Because this position agnostic is no more close to this than it is a theist. A theist can say, oh, look, you don't subscribe to theist, right? You don't subscribe to God existing, okay? But you're down here, and if you're down here on the I, right? I down here, what do we determine for validity? If I is true, E has to be false, right? So you can't be an atheist, right? Which makes sense. I mean, right? I mean, well, let's see. We don't believe, yeah. If you think I is true, then E is false. and then I and E are indeterminate. So I don't know whether you do not believe that you don't believe that there isn't a God, which would be up here. So this can't be true. But I don't know if it is, you don't believe there isn't a God. I can't determine if you do not believe there is no God because you do believe there is one, which would be A, or you're agnostic and have no position either way. So that is why I use the square of opposition just to check for validity. This is why I find that the atheists that are saying I merely lack a belief are not understanding the logic behind what they're saying. They're not understanding. They're giving a very ambiguous position, if it's even a position at all, because there's no way to determine what their position actually is. It's literally indeterminate because they're down here on the square of opposition. They're not telling you whether they're up here, or they're not telling you if they're both of these right here, which is perfectly fine, right? You can have both of these contraries, because subcontraries can both be true, right? They both can't be false. The reason why they both can't be false is because if you're this up here on the right, if you're an atheist, this has to be true. If you're up here on the theist, this has to be true, right? And you have to. And if you're neither of these, then the only thing left is both of these be true in the bottom, I and O. So, anyways, that's the square of opposition. That's the canonical form. This is why, again, I used it to prove the validity of my argument that we should reject the weak atheist, ascribing atheism to weak atheism, or think of atheism in the negative. I find it to be, I'm not going to say illogical per se, but it definitely is ambiguous. It's absolutely ambiguous. It has no useful connotations. And so, why use it? If it's what I call axiologically depreciated, why use that type of nomenclature? Because it doesn't tell anybody anything. And this is actual evidence of this. This is illogical. When atheists say, "Oh, I want to be logical," okay, great. Show me how you can be logical when you just said, "I'm giving you my position. You know exactly what my position is when I say I don't believe God exists." No, I don't know what your position is. I have no idea. Either it's because you believe there are no gods, or you don't have a position either way, and you're trying to assume agnostic. But do you guys agree, and it's Frida, because I know you know about logic, do you agree with me that the person who subscribes to lack of belief atheism, or lacktheism, or weak atheism, what do you want to call it, negative atheism, it is indeterminate and is ambiguous. Therefore, because it is indeterminate, I argue that it makes it axiologically depreciated, meaning less valuable. Why would you want a term that's ambiguous, right? Nowadays, normally, if somebody says they're a theist, it's not ambiguous, right? Okay, yeah, they believe there's a God. There's no ambiguity there. But now when you say atheist, there's ambiguity there because atheists are using it two different ways. There's no ambiguity in atheist in the literature. If you see atheist, it means the person who believes there are no gods. Almost every single time, unless otherwise stated. There's no ambiguity there. Just like if you see theist, it means somebody who believes that God exists. There's no ambiguity there. These words do not have any kind of ambiguity when read in the literature, unless it specifically states, "Oh, I'm using atheism in the negative case for whatever reason." And that's only a relatively new phenomenon. Even Draper points that out. I think Draper said something along the lines of, years ago, if you saw atheism, it would never even cross your mind to think it was lack of belief. It always was understood as the belief that God does not exist. And so why atheists have wanted to change it to add ambiguity is really beyond me. But this proves that it does make it ambiguous, because now you have two variations of atheists. You have the atheists who believe God exists, or God does not exist. You have the atheists who just don't believe, which means that they have no position either way, which means it's overlapping and subsuming the agnostic position. So, anyways, that's my little TED Talk for the day. I want it to be short, be sweet, so people can watch this video. But real quick, Anastrata, do you agree? Let me know. Let me know in the comment section. But that is how the canonical version of the square of opposition works. Again, I know there are issues with it when you're dealing with empty sets and existential import. I'm not going to get into that. It's kind of irrelevant. We're assuming, just for argumentation's sake, that there's at least one element in these sets, so you don't have any other problems with existential import. But definitely, atheists out there, I'd love to see the counter arguments. I would love to see how you justify holding to lack of belief atheism now that you know that it is unequivocally ambiguous or indeterminate, because you're down here on the square of opposition. And if you're down here on the square of opposition, the only thing you can determine from that is that you're not a theist. You cannot determine these other two positions, that you're one of these other two positions. And I've proven that with other proofs as well. I mean, I've shown that using actual logic and proven that if you're this position, you're either this or you're that. There are no other options. And so it doesn't tell me what your actual position is. It just tells me you're not this. That doesn't help me much, right? If you say I'm a non-duck, it doesn't tell me what you are. And so this is why I wish they would stop trying to have these knee-jerk Pavlovian responses and saying, oh, well, atheism is just a lack of belief. No, it's not. It's never been that way. It will probably never be that way because it's silly. It's ambiguous. And why atheists even want that to be the case, I have no idea. Other than for demographics and political power and voting, I understand that. But that's a utilitarian argument. That is not a logical argument. It's not even an epistemic argument. So maybe atheists would just need to stop and pause and say, okay, this really makes sense. Do I really want this to be the case? No, it's not defined well enough to tell a person really what my position is. Therefore, I don't want to be ambiguous, right? So there you go. And thank you guys for watching. If you guys got comments, let me know in the comments section, and I will see you later.